Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our series of Lunch with a Friends, series of live webinars here. I'm Chris Knopp, the Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. I want to begin by wishing all of you well. I hope that you are getting through this COVID-19 pandemic safely. We're all in this together, and we'll get through this together here. For over 40 years, Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness has been the leader in protecting the boundary waters and connecting people to the boundary waters. And our success is because of you, all of you that support Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And I want to thank all of you, the hundreds of you that donated to Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness during last week's Giving Week. Today, the work of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness focuses on three areas: wilderness, people, and community. For the wilderness, we're a leader in fighting the two mines that present one threat to the boundary waters. Those two mines are twin metals and polymet, and the one threat is sulfide mining. And we're in last week's webinar, one of last week's webinars highlighted our fight, our new legal fight to stop twin metals. For people, our No Boundaries to the Boundary Waters program connects students all across Minnesota to the boundary waters through classroom education, online programs, and scholarships for multi-day wilderness canoe trips. And finally, for community, we understand that the communities that are gateways to the boundary waters, Ely, Grand Marais, the North Shore, and the like, have a shared future with the wilderness, and they need to thrive in order for the wilderness to be protected. I am so very excited, and we have gotten so many messages over the last few days here on today's presentation, Boundary Waters Fishing Tips and Tricks. And we have, as a presenter, Rob Crist. Rob is an angler who is so enthusiastic about fishing that it'll inspire you to get out and go fishing when the current restrictions are lifted here. Rob, in his other time, is a patent attorney in Minneapolis. Before I turn this over to Rob here, a few housekeeping items here. There at the bottom of your screen there, you will see, if you move your cursor, a question and answer tab there. You can ask questions during the presentation, and I'll save them up so that that Rob can answer them after his presentation. There's also a chat button there, and you can make comments, and we can collect those and have Rob respond to those. Well, I know that fishing is such an integral part for many of our trips to the boundary waters, and I am so very excited to have Rob, such an experienced angler, share his tips and tricks with us. So without further ado, Rob, take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris. Super glad to be doing this. Super glad to be talking to everyone here. I want to just start things off here with kind of a little bit of a lighthearted quote from a local writer out of Door County. This is kind of how I am going to take on this presentation today, with a little bit of lightheartedness, knowing that there really truly are no rights and wrongs. It's just about being passionate about fishing. That's really what is going to help you become a better angler, keep your mind inquisitive about learning new techniques and new lures, and get your time out on the water. So given these times, I know there's shortage of other things, but fishing poles should be one of those. So in order to go through this presentation, I want to break things down into kind of the fishing logistics that we need to do, as all the fishing variables that need to happen. Before we get to figuring out the lures, the presentations, the line setup, we really need to cover our basis of being able to get out on the water. And two of those factors really are following the fishing regulations and having a fishing license. We thankfully are in a state that is really proactive. The DNR helps quite a lot to get us as fishermen to get out the information in order for us to learn the regulations to follow. One important thing to note is that with respect to the boundary waters, there are special fishing regulations for lakes that are at least partially within the boundary waters, as well as fully within the boundary waters. I'm not going to go through all those here because I'd like to get to some of the more quote unquote fun topics, but I've provided a link down below, and this presentation will be available for everyone later to go and read on the fishing regulations. Please do check them up before you go. They can vary quite a lot by lake. Another really important logistic is getting the equipment in line before we even get out there. Once you put that canoe over your head and that pack on your back, you can't go back to the car when you're 15 miles in and unable to have the right equipment to fish. So a couple of unique things I feel like you need in the boundary waters are certainly, I'm going to do a little show and tell for you here, are a pair of pliers. When you're up there, if you fish with barbed hooks or without barbed hooks, or you catch one of those toothy northern, a pair of pliers really can come in handy. If you accidentally hook yourself, it certainly can be a really good part of your first aid kit. Another unique thing is an anchor mechanism. So when you're in the boundary waters, the wind can really push your canoe around quite a lot, or if you're fishing below a waterfall or in some kind of current, the wind and water can really move your canoe. And the more time you paddle to get into position, it's the less time your line is probably in the water in the right spot, and the less chance you'll catch a fish. So instead of hauling in an entire anchor that you would use in normal boating, what you can bring is a basketball net anchor. And all this is one end tied together, so it's closed at the bottom, and then all the top loops are put around a carabiner. What you can do with this is fill it with rocks and tie a line to it and throw it over the side of your canoe, and that should position you where you'd like to be. Another piece of equipment involves the first consideration here is portaging, which is ever important whenever you're planning to go deep into the woods. Carrying rods on a portage loose is just the absolute equation for breaking a rod. I am guilty of doing it. It'll probably happen again to me. It's just an unfortunate consequence of having to carry everything with you. So the best thing to do when carrying rods into the boundary waters is to actually put them under the gunnels in your canoe. And in order to do that, I use two different types of ties. Night Eyes makes these flexible ties here that you can twist and secure your rod to the gunnel. And then there's another piece of equipment called a dealy bob. And I joked earlier, I hope nobody asks me how to spell that to check it up, because I do not know, but I do know they work, and they're not that expensive, and they're really useful for tying things to the gunnels. When tying your rods to the gunnels, I would recommend that you do not have your reels on there. Your rod can actually bend in the incorrect way, and it put improper stress on the rod itself and cause some damage. There's some other equipment that we can cover later, but that really is some of the most important consideration for equipment. The other thing is weight. When we're talking about weight, my first time in the boundary waters, I think I brought an entire tackle bag, 5 sleeves, 3 pounds of jig heads, just way too much weight, unnecessary, and certainly made single portaging very difficult. So what you really need to do is go through and prioritize the equipment that you're bringing in by weight, by size, and by what you really think you're going to use. Fishing lures are really not meant for catching fish. They're meant for catching fishing men and women. So make sure you don't fall susceptible to that and bring what you're actually going to use. The last consideration we'll talk about more when we talk about finding the proper lake structure, and that's human power. You can't just fire up your 2-stroke and go across the lake if that one spot you're on is not working. So be cognizant of that. Make sure that you put an ideal plan together for yourself about where you're going, how you're going to fish there, and if that spot doesn't work, what's plan B. All right, now we're getting into some of the more fun stuff, the fishing variables. And I've tried to split this up in an organizational scheme that simplifies each factor, but do know that one of the great things about fishing is it's one equation with a lot of variables. So changing one simple variable could be the difference between you in the bow catching all the walleye and your partner in the stern missing everything. So just make sure that you take this all into account. So I split this up into species, and I'm going to show an app called Lake Finder. The technique you use, the lake structure, I'm going to identify how you can find that when you're there or beforehand. And beforehand, there's a few apps. Google Earth is very, very useful. Those satellite images can show you reefs, can show you boulder fields, can show you unique shore structure that from a top-down view, that's really important. Navionics, as well as your Boundary Waters maps, can be very useful for the contour lines. And then MNDNR actually has a very good website that has some lake structure and lake maps on there as well. Two of the other variables that are ever present are weather and time of year, and I certainly plan on touching you know, what happens in spring, summer, and fall during this presentation. So this is the Lake Finder app. This is available, I have the link down below, for almost every lake in the Boundary Waters. What's great about this is it's an actual survey done by the DNR that categorizes everything by numbers and species of fish, as well as the size of fish you're looking for. So here I've just pulled Seagull Lake, which is known as being a pretty good lake trout lake. You can see the numbers here are not necessarily all that self-represented here, but it certainly is a pretty good lake for lake trout. An interesting lake to pull up here would have been Saginaw, which obviously has right next to it the walleye state record. I think it's purported that there are other state records that can come from that lake, which is another unique factor of the Boundary Waters. You can go for certainly really good numbers because they're under pressured lakes, but you can also go for large fish there as well. One thing I'd also like to note here is that before you leave to go to the Boundary Waters, use this app. You need to pre-plan, because if you go, for instance, if you go to a lake looking for walleye, but that lake only has lake trout in it, you can fish all day for walleye, you're never gonna get one. So search the lakes up that you plan on visiting beforehand in order to figure out maybe what route you'd like to take or what species you'd specifically like to go for on your pre-planned route. There are numerous techniques for fishing, a lot. These are just some of the top ones that I tend to use there. I'm going to cover the top 3 in a little more detail here in their rigging, but I do want to note that a topwater rig may be one of the most fun presentations there are. You use a frog, for instance, and I have one here. I'm going to try to hold it up for everyone to see. It is a goofy looking long tail thing that sits and floats on top of the water that can just entice fish for the most intense bite you're going to find. When they break water and jump out, smallmouth and northern, it is fun for everyone involved. It is an absolute blast. The hook ratios can be a little lower, but it certainly is a lot of fun. So the first technique we're going to talk about is jigging. Jigging is the quintessential Minnesota technique for fishing. It involves a very simple setup that can tackle almost any species out there. It is very much a multi-species. It targets the 4 main fish in the Boundary Waters, which the game fish, which would be smallmouth, walleye, northern, and lake trout. Now, lake trout jigging is a little different than the other 3. It certainly involves a heavier setup as well as some deeper depths usually, but it is at its core the same rig that you see on the top right. Now, notably, you can use artificial lure, and I've highlighted 2 below here. And those 2 have I put those specifically in there because they have 2 very different actions. So the twister tail type model on the left, the Kalen's Lunker Grub, is in my bag every single time I go up, and in at least 3 different colors. The one I'm showing you there is a perch or a yellow gold copper fleck, and it's about a 3-inch or a 4-inch size grub, and that will go simply on the jig head. There is some controversy if it's tail down or tail up. I'll let you decide on your own. But it puts out a very smooth twisting action with its tail. Those will entice fish that maybe aren't as active, but certainly are looking to eat. The Kitech Swing Impact on the right is always in my bag as well, and it is a paddle tail action, which actually puts off a lot more vibration in the water and will get more aggressive fish to come and attack it. If one doesn't work, try the other. But if I were you, just to recommend one, I would start with a grub type or a twister tail type that's on the left. Now, the jig that I was talking about here is, they come in a variety of weights. They come in 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce, 3/8. My recommendation is to start with an 8 ounce. Some folks prefer the 1/4 ounce, but at the end of the day, the expression is to use the lightest weight you can get away with. And so I start with an 8 ounce, especially if I'm fishing in anything less than 20 feet. If you're going deeper than that, a 1/4 ounce can get you down to where the fish are a little quicker. Now, circling back to the live bait, you can use earthworms, you can use leeches, you can use minnows in this presentation. But one thing you should note is that while live bait is legal in the boundary waters, if you travel north to Quetico, live bait and barred hooks are not permitted. Now, live bait, although it is permitted in the boundary waters, there are certain rules to follow. If you bring in a pound of leeches and you only go through half of that for whatever reason, it is not proper to dump them in the water or throw them back in the woods. It is correct to actually pack them out with you. Pack in, pack out. One unique thing about this rig is that you can make it weedless. If you hook the top of that hook right back into the plastic up top, you can actually prevent that sharp bit of the hook from taking those weeds and making it very frustrating fishing, because every time if you think you have a bite, you have another bit of cattail or something else to it. The basic rig here, and I apologize for my crude drawing, but I tried to get it as clear as I could. The rod is on the right in case you're curious, the line is on the left, is pretty simple. What I prefer to use is braided line as my main line, meaning that's what goes all the way to the reel and then starts to go towards the terminal end. Braided line has a lot of advantages. Braided line is very strong for its diameter size, meaning that for its size, a smaller diameter is stronger than the other two types of line, which is fluorocarbon and monofilament. Braided line also has zero stretch. Zero stretch line really helps increase the sensitivity that you have. And I will tell you the biggest advantage I found, the biggest technique skill that I was able to develop is the sensitivity on this rig. If you can tell the difference between your jig scraping against the rock on a bottom, hitting weeds, or actually getting hit by a fish, your hook sets are going to go much better for you and you're going to lose less jigs. The sensitivity is important. So I have my main braid running down to a swivel, and a swivel is simply just a 2 eyelet with a little ball bearing swivel or just a type of swivel there that prevents your line from twisting. You can absolutely get some more twisting that happens in here, but it's best to put a little swivel there to prevent that and allow yourself a breakage point here. Your back line, your main braid, can be a little stronger, say 10, 12, 15 pound test. And then I like to use a leader that's a little less strong for a couple reasons. One, fluorocarbon is a great line, but because it's not as strong per diameter size, you actually need a larger diameter fluorocarbon to match the same pound test as your braid. And the point of fluorocarbon is that it is twofold. One, it's nearly invisible underwater, and it actually sinks as well. The fluorocarbon absorbs water, and so that helps get your dig down even faster. If you will use, for instance, a 10-pound braid test, then you can go and use maybe an 8 or 6 pound fluorocarbon. Now, tying a jig just on the end is as simple as that. You can use almost any color you want. My preferences are chartreuse, black, and pink. If one color is not working, switch it. If your canoe partner is catching with another color, switch to their color. Just make sure you're flexible and bring multiples of each. You will get snagged on the bottom. It's inevitable in this presentation. Try to canoe over the top of it and pull your line out. If that doesn't work, please do not grab the braided line and yank up. It will cut you. It is very thin line. Just cut your losses and be prepared to re-reg a few times. The next one here is trolling. And I prefer to, I don't prefer, I like using this for walleye as well, but I'm going to talk about it with respect to lake trout. Lake trout is unique in that it's usually a deeper fish. The spring being a different scenario, they certainly come up in the spring. They're very, very active in the spring and is easily the best time to fish for them. But in order to get deep, you need to have a method of getting down there. And this is my preferred way. It's a 3-way swivel, which is this black object in the middle. You have your main braid line that ties to the swivel, and then you have your fluorocarbon leader. But what's different is on this bottom swivel, you're going to put a 2-3 foot, 1.5 foot line, any line, doesn't matter, fluoro, braid, or mono. Mono's cheaper, so maybe best to use, tied to a drop weight. I would recommend starting with a 1/2 ounce, work your way up from there, 1/2 ounce, ounce, 1.5 ounces, and then troll. Now, trolling can be a little difficult. It takes a little time to get used to. Certainly do not troll as if you're traveling. You will burn this lure by fish. You're not looking to go 3.5 miles an hour here. One approach is to have trade off, have the partner in the front paddle, then the back, or just to lean back and take your time and paddle. One technique I like to use is called the S turn, And that's basically don't paddle in a straight line, but allow your canoe to flip back and forth. And when it gets to the apex of that turn, the lure will actually change velocity, and that might be enough to trigger a fish. On this fluorocarbon leader, I like to tie a spoon. This is a Daredevil. I showed silver and blue. I've heard you can fish with any color you want as long as it involves silver. I know people catch them with red devils. I haven't. 5 of diamonds works for people, but silver and blue or just plain silver seems to work the best. A Rapala tail dancer is a really interesting banana type style bait, meaning you can see here that the lure has a little bit of a curvature to it. And that gets a very wide wobble, displaces a lot of water, and will hopefully attract lake trout from a large distance away. Note, this is a trolling type presentation, and trolling has its own issues with it. You can certainly bring a rod holder and fasten it to your canoe. You can try to snip it between your legs, or you can somehow rig it, with your pack holding it down. But do know that when lake trout hit, they tend to hit hard. So be ready to grab that rod before you've donated an entire rig setup to the lake. The last one I'm going to cover in detail here is the slip bobber rig, which is a fan favorite for sure. It is the most visual presentation for new fishermen, for fishermen that have been doing it for a long time. You watch the fish take the lure basically with the bobber action. It's a very fun presentation. Because I said it's good for new, it's very good for younger anglers. Fishing, I don't tend to find it boring, but if it's not happening and they're not biting and it's slow, sometimes watching a bobber will help the younger or the newer fisher folks be able to keep the enthusiasm going a little longer. This is really good for slow bites because it just sits the bait right at the fish's eye level, letting them take their time to look at it and wait. You're not running a bait by them for them to chase, it's sitting there waiting for them. My setup here is very similar to just a regular jig setup with the added equipment of a bobber stop, and bead. The bobber, I like to use a snap swivel as well here just because of line twist. It certainly isn't required, but you put your bobber above the snap swivel, you have a bead and a braid tie here. You can actually, you buy it all as a pack. It's not hard to do. You just have to make sure to do it in the right order. My favorite float here is the wobble. It actually moves a little bit more than I think the traditional one with, you have the spike on the top and the bottom of the bobber. I think the wave action actually imparts a little more action onto the leech or earthworm below. Could just be my experiences, but I think it works well. And that's important to note. So this is a live bait presentation. This will not work with just sitting a grub down there because there's no action being imparted on the tail. You really do need to carry in live bait, which brings us into the issue again of portaging. Carrying in a leech bucket is not fun. It's when you're on a portage and you're holding the leech bucket in one hand, a canoe over your head in the other, and the leech water splashing up on you, it's just not fun. Usually you have to play a game of paper, rock, scissors or something in your group to see who's gonna lose and carry the leech bucket. So do take that into consideration if this is how you're gonna go. It is a very fun way to fish, but it does require live bait. All right, I have a few minutes here remaining and I wanna talk about one of my favorite things, which is lures, choosing what lure to use, and is it the weather, the time of year, how does it go? So with respect to lures, the most important thing to think of is the action. It's not the color, it's the action. These are some of my 4 favorite. The shadow wrap is a jerk type style bait, meaning you can jerk your rod. It will entice action on any fish. I've caught 4 of the game species on this lure. That yellow perch color is my favorite. The Aglia here is probably, they purport, has caught the most world records of any lure. It will catch fish, 100%. It will get weeded up, so be careful in the weeds, but it will work. It absolutely will work. The floating Rapala here is the classic lure. It can be trolled as well as the shadow wrap. It doesn't fly as far when you cast because it is all just balsa wood. There are no weight transfer bearings in there, but the action is classic. Fish still go after it. The color here, silver and black, is really important. Here's a shad wrap, which is a little smaller profile there, and that's in gold and black. And I would recommend those 2 colors as well as the perch color to start out with. The Yamamoto Cinco is a worm that is a little heavier than your classic fishing worm. It's a little denser plastic and typically hooked right in the center, and it allows the ends to flap down, and you can jig that, and that action will absolutely entice fish. I love smallmouth fishing with that lure. Now, for colors, the easiest way to think of this is to associate the daylight or the sun levels to the lure color. The brighter the sky, the lighter the lure, the darker the sky, the darker the lure. I would use this in sunny conditions. I would use this color in darker conditions. That's the way that fish respond. Now, another way to look at it, of course, is to match the hatch, as they say. Match the coloration of the bait fish. If you're going for lake trout, go for something that looks like a whitefish, a Cisco. You use something that's white. You use something that's silvery. You use something that they're going to eat. Walleye eat tinier walleye. They eat perch. So go for a perch type coloration. Now, with respect to the weather, there are tons of sayings out there about fishing before or after a storm. Me personally, I will fish before, during, and after a front as long as it's safe to do. I think it depends on the fish, not you. The fish, like, for instance, I remember as a kid being told it doesn't matter to fish if it's raining, they're already wet, right? So if it's not lightning and it's not very windy, it's safe conditions to be out there. If it's a safe time to fish, it's a fine time to fish. I personally have found no big difference before or after a front. I know barometric pressure does affect fish, but I haven't found any common thread there for me. There are a lot of other lures out there. There are things like the jointed wrap here, which will impart quite a lot of action. It has a hinge in the middle. There is another topwater here, a Hadon 13, which is great. It's a little frog pattern there. And if you're fishing super shallow, another lure to look at is a square bill. And that's going to be hard to see there, but that bill is square. And that will actually hit off rocks and help deflect weeds as well. It's very useful in the shallows. And that's actually a crawfish coloration, which there are crawfish, crayfish, crawdads, however you want to say it, in the boundary waters. And smallmouth do eat them, and they enjoy them. So I would, if you see crawfish when you're at camp, think about throwing one of those colors. Now, I have not saved myself a ton of time on locations, but I'm going to cover them. And I think it's important that you know that finding the location is really about pre-planning. If you pre-plan ahead of time, knowing that, hey, there's moving water, there's sunken islands, there's deep holes here via the maps or Navionics or however else, the pre-planning will save you a ton of time searching. You'll at least know a spot to go to. Your maps are your friends, so go with that. But we're going to hit 4 main areas: the shoreline, weed line, sunken islands, as well as moving water. So moving water is probably every time I see moving water, I'm thinking about grabbing my fishing rod. Every time. Fish like moving water. They like the current. They like the bigger fish like deeper pools off the current. They'll basically sit there and snipe the bait fish as they flow down the current. So one way of doing this is to have your canoe positioned down of the falls or down of the river inlet, throw up towards it, and let it come back with the current. Let that bait that you've put out there, make it look like it's a bait fish coming over the falls and down to the fish. You can do that with the slip bobber that we talked about. You can do that with the jig presentation. You can do that by throwing one of those cranks that we've talked about. 2 things to note. It's not bad to fish from shore here. In fact, it's a very safe way to do it. Get offshore out of the moving water so your canoe's not getting tipped, and throw the same way as we discussed already. In fact, you can see this guy here is using a little jig presentation with a piece of plastic lure on the end there, throwing up into the moving water. If you don't want to fish from shore, the basketball net anchor we talked about comes in handy here. Sit there and cast up into the falls. Sunken islands. Now these are easiest to find by a map. This is a map of Seagull from Navionics, and you can see what a sunken island is as I'm pointing out here. It is just a raised bit of land from the lake's bottom surface, from the lake surface. If it comes up 20, 30 feet and has sharp transition zones down, that hump will attract bait fish, will attract vegetation to grow. and it will have larger fish there. The predator fish will be around there looking towards the hump. You can also use visual clues. If you see that vegetation in the vast lake, you all of a sudden see some weeds, that's going to be a sunken island and you should fish it. If you see a few rocks sticking up, in fact, the last time I was on, well, the only time I've been on Stewart Lake, we weren't intending on being there. It was a loop trip, and I wanted to fish. We had plenty of time to go, and I went out, didn't know anything about the lake, but I saw a few rocks sticking up on the south side of the lake, and I started casting at it. I paddled along it. I could see where the water dropped off. The clarity in the boundary waters is great, 15, 20 feet in some lakes. So make sure that you wear a pair of polarized glasses and look down there. And if you see where that goes from clear to dark, throw your line and take a crank down along there. That sunken island will hold some fish. I was able to catch walleye dinner for everybody in that night. So it was great. It worked out well, just using visual clues. One thing I will note on this is try to keep your distance. Sitting right on top of the island will spook the fish. Throw your lure towards it and bring it back to yourself. Now the shoreline. Couple things to note about this. A point is just as it sounds. It's where the land comes up to a peninsula. I would recommend starting on the wind-blown side, meaning the side that's getting hit by the wind. The bait fish tend to be on that wind-blown side, and then the walleye or smallmouth are looking up there to attack those. I really like seeing this when I'm paddling on the right. I like seeing rock faces, and I am not a cliff jumper. I'm not necessarily afraid of heights. I just don't do it. So I like it because I know it holds fish. Sheer rock faces like that, throw your jig up to it, let it sink to the bottom, and come up with your jig. It works very well. A saddle is kind of the opposite of what you have with a hump. If you see two pieces of land separated by a channel of water, that's usually a saddle. And that's a little depression in the lake's floor that you can actually consider a deeper spot, and fish will be held there. Weed lines. Weed lines are great, especially in the spring. If you're going walleye fishing in the spring, look for weed lines. They're going to be shallow. We're talking 5-6 feet. Weed lines are as they sound. It's just weeds. It's weeds presented. There's lily pads. There's stick weeds. There's wild rice. It's a great area to throw topwater, which we've seen. Really good area to sight fish. It's shallow. You're likely going to see to the bottom. And it will hold the bait fish, and therefore the big fish will be there. If you can find a weed line closer to a deep pool, that's even better. The deep pool is going to hold the fish, and the weed line will hold the bait. You just got to get those two to meet, hopefully. Those are the 4 main areas to look, and there's a lot more we can go into. I really would like to cover more. In fact, we haven't even talked about ice fishing. We haven't talked about making dinner with fish. We haven't talked about a lot of things, but I do appreciate your time here. I'm looking forward to answering some questions and seeing what you've got. Thank you all very much for your time, and let's see what questions we have.
You know, Rob, we have several questions lined up here. You know, maybe getting to one here. Would you identify a couple favorite spots that you have when you go to the Boundary Waters? A couple favorite fishing spots that you like?
Yeah, okay. So this, I should have expected this question to come, and I certainly will tell you some. I will tell you that not everyone's willing to share every spot, and I do have some spots I'd like to keep on my own. Part of the reasoning is it's fun to find your own spots. When you get your own little secret, like little honey hole of fish, you want to hold it to yourself. But a couple of the really big hot spots, I will say below Curtain Falls is a very good spot. It's known quite well for it. I will say that south side of Stewart, I thought was really good. The main thing, again, is if you find moving water, that's where it's going to be. That's kind of why I like to talk of it in generality. So you can apply these to find those hot spots. But there are more out there, and there are lakes and bodies of water that are popular that I haven't fished. But I would say that's a very popular one. Below Lower Basswood Falls is also a very popular spot that definitely holds fish. That's a good spot as well.
Now, what about some seasonal fishing here? If you were to do a spring, early summer trip for lake trout, you know, any suggestions off the Gunflint?
Yeah, absolutely. So off the Gunflint, there is Oyster Lake, which is well known for it. There aren't as many. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the echo. If we go off the Gunflint, Seagull absolutely is a great lake. There are plenty of lake trout lakes over that way. Tuscarora is another good one. I would recommend going out there if it's spring. Then again, use that shallow presentation, a three-way swivel, a spoon, or a trolling Rapala. There are a lot of lake trouts there, and there are lake trout lakes that are actually approachable with not too far of a difference from the entry point. The best way to find where those are, again, is that lake finder, for sure.
You know, we had an earlier question that had someone wanted to know if there were topo maps online that you use for that, or do you typically use a hard copy of the map, Rob?
I do both. So if I'm at the house before I go up on a trip, I will go online, and Navionics is a web app that you can use. And then the DNR has those websites as well. I believe that Voyager Maps also has an online capability to view the maps, but that is more for me to get an idea of it. I like the hard copies obviously when you're up there. I don't like printing them off. I like to get the Mackenzie, the Fisher, or whatever, and rely on those.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to annotate your maps, right? If you catch fish in a certain area, I mark my maps, SMB for smallmouth bass, lake trout here, walleye here. It's gonna be your guide. It's like your little journal when you get up there. So when you go back, you can remind yourself. For instance, I have an Iron Lake map that is just written all over. Iron Lake's a great fishing lake, by the way. That's below Curtain Falls. So that's another good destination to go.
You know, in the dog days of August, you know, you have some suggestions for that when the fishing is generally a little slower?
Yeah, it goes to the opposite of what I said earlier. So not weed lines, not shallow, go deep. They're looking for colder water in the summer. So look for those saddles or look for the deep pools. Your topo map's going to help you there. You can't see on Google Earth, you can't see a deep hole. So look at your topo map and look for a deep hole. Those rock faces that we showed earlier, that's a really good spot. Usually that means it's going to be deep water up against those rock faces. I've done that in Loch Rocroy has a lot of those rock faces. And if you see them in August or July, throw at them and let that lure go down to depth.
You know, what about some late fall fishing, you know, in late September, October or so? Any suggestions on good places for fishing at that time of year?
Yeah, so fall has a few unique circumstances. The biggest one being lake turnover. And that is where the temperatures shift and the lake is starting to go into freezing. Water has the unique property of the solid being less dense than its liquid. So it's a great thing, but it's also difficult when the lake flips over. So you need to be mindful of your water temperatures quite a lot. But fish will start to move up in the fall. They will start to come shallow. Lake trout especially will start to come shallow and they'll start to turn on in the fall. You kind of can go back towards your spring presentations when the water was between 40 and 50 degrees. You can kind of go back to that in the fall. It basically starts shallow, goes deep in the summer, and comes back shallow. Weed lines are not necessarily as effective for me in the fall. Look for boulder fields that are a little shallower in the fall.
Okay. And Eva, there's a question about, I know this is focused on the boundary waters, but in the Quetico, are there lake surveys in the Quetico that you know of?
Not that I know of. I'm not, I would look to online forums for that. You can definitely search for, if you have a specific lake you're going to, definitely do some searching online for it. People are not afraid to talk about the great days they had fishing there. But do take it, it is the internet, take it with a grain of salt, but it is an indication that that species may be there.
And there's a question about knots here. What fishing knot do you use for fluorocarbon there?
Okay, so knots. That's another presentation, honestly.
Right.
But I have two main knots I like to use, and it's not really by the type of line. It's more of where I'm tying it to on the terminal end. If I'm doing a snap swivel or a swivel tie, I like a Palomar knot. Palomar. I hope it's something close to that. What it does is it doubles everything up on the eyelet of the hook or on the tackle that you're tying it to. So everything should be doubled. That is my go-to knot. The second knot I go to is an improved clinch knot, which is a classic little twist around itself and back through and pull. Make sure you wet the line on that one. That's a really good one. Knots are one of those confidence things where you need to tie it yourself and build confidence in it and make sure that's what you want to go for. There are crazy knots out there. There are knots, the San Diego Jam knot, the super improved clench. There's a lot of different knots, but the first two I would work on is the improved clench and the Palomar. Then maybe third, if you want to do a loop knot for a crankbait, there's a Rapala or Rapala knot that you should look into that will actually do a loop that get tied to the crank. So it has more action supposedly.
Great. Do you have any suggestions for the walleye presentations when they're going after mayflies after large hatch?
Good luck. That's the first thing. So if you wind up hitting the mayfly hatch, it's difficult. It's super difficult. I would tend to go with a slower presentation like a slip bobber or a slow crank or something like that. I certainly wouldn't go for something active. Now, usually the bigger fish may be lower in the water column there, so you could try trolling lower, and the smaller fish are eating the mayflies up top. It's tough. That's tough fishing. It's like the 2 weeks after walleye spawn, when the water hits 50 degrees, it gets very tough fishing, even in the boundary waters. The fish just, they know what they want and they know what they don't at that time, that either that season or that time of year. It's tough. It's tough.
Great. We have a question about going out of sawbill. So if you're going for walleye fishing in June and on sawbill smoke or thereabouts, any suggestions on tips for walleye fishing then?
The specific tips on those lakes, no. I've actually only traveled through. I haven't really stayed on there any long destination time to fish. I would certainly, in that neck of the woods, I would look definitely for lake structure that's below the water. I know those lakes can have some islands in them, so I would certainly look for that. It's rocky. I know they're rocky, so be ready to lose a few jigs there. Unfortunately, I don't have any specific spots there, so I apologize.
Just talk a little bit about water temperature and what you're thinking of, and what water temperature is best for fishing, or how you adjust your fishing as water temperature changes.
Yeah. Okay. So with respect to water temperature and fish, the one I know the most about is really walleye. So walleye spawn somewhere between 42 and 48 degrees, somewhere in there, 40, 50, 42, 48. And when they're spawning, they're very active eaters. We, as a state, though, have made regulations where we typically don't get a fish during them. Sometimes it hits late, so sometimes we can get them during that season. But when the water temperature hits 50 degrees, the fish tend to shut down because they're in transition. And when they're in transition, that means they're moving to their summer spots. They're kind of reeling from spawning. It takes a lot of energy out of them. They're not hungry for some reason. They just don't want to eat. So what you need to do is be prepared for multiple approaches. One surefire way is to troll. If you troll a lure, and you need to be maybe a little deeper than that 5-6 foot range I said earlier, try starting at 10, 12 feet and troll there and see if the fish are coming down. Usually you can catch one or two that way. When you catch one trolling, go back there and start jigging or throwing a crank there. After 2 weeks, when you get, water temperature is now 54, 56 degrees, maybe even higher after 2 weeks, depending on our spring, then they're going to go into summer mode and they're going to put the feed bag on. And it's a really good time to fish. It's a very, very good time to fish after 2 weeks of spawn, because they start getting into their old habits. They go back to where they're used to being. And you can start looking for those transition zones again, not necessarily the deep, not necessarily the shallow, but look for where it transitions pretty smoothly from under the other, and hopefully the walleye are hanging out there.
Rob, we have a live bait question. Is there a time of year that you prefer minnows or worms to leeches, or vice versa?
Yeah, if the water's cold, if the water's really cold, I don't like leeches. Leeches just tend to curl up really tight, and they don't give any action. They just sit in a ball there on your jig. So then I would prefer to go with minnows, especially the minnows in the spring are probably my favorite, because they're easier to keep alive when you're up there, and they tend to match more of what they're eating. If you don't get that, then and it's cold water, then resort to earthworms. In the summer or warmer water, I absolutely go leeches. Fall, on the other hand, leeches tend to be small, if you can even find them. They've been very hard to find in the past few years. If you can go with leeches in the fall and you find some decent sized ones, then go with those. If not, worms will be fine too.
Great. We had a question about, there's a lot of concern with lead in fishing lures and things like that. But maybe you want to talk a little bit about how jig manufacturers are adapting to that.
Yeah, so this is kind of another hot topic, certainly after water gremlin has had their issues in the past few months. So I will say just up front, my views here are my personal views. They're not the friends. It's kind of a bit of a loaded topic in the fishing world. I know that there are other types of metal or jigs out there. Titanium, especially during ice fishing, I use that quite a lot. It's a much more denser metal. It will drop quicker for the size. So they're very useful jigs. They are a little more expensive, and they are not as readily accessible as, say, the lead. I do know that lead, the reasoning behind it for anyone who may not be apprised is that it does affect the loon population. And I've heard it affects the hatching of loons. I think it makes the eggs a little soft or something. I'm not an expert by any means. So there are other options out there. And if it is a concern to you, or you want to do more research on it and find out, there are other metals you can use, and you can find them online for sure. And in fact, it may be even a better jig for you to use over lead, despite all the other issues. I personally use a mixed bag. I have old lead that I've still got that I'd like to use, and I have newer jigs that I use as well. So it is still allowed in Minnesota. If they change the law, then of course I'll make sure I switch 100% over.
There was another environmental question that's come up, that difference between whether you call them leaf worms versus the invasive crawlers and that. Maybe you want to talk about have some thoughts on the invasive species with worms here.
Yeah. So if everyone's not aware of that, earthworms are invasive here. That was news to me a few years back. I think that's the critical reason why if you pack them in, you need to pack them out. You can't dump them in the water. You can't dump them on land. I prefer using the crawlers because of their size and the fact that they move a lot more when you use them as bait. There's certainly other alternatives you can use, and I advocate for them. I must admit I don't always use them. Leeches are native. Leeches are fine. And to my knowledge, I don't see any issue with those. But again, there's you cannot dump them when you're out there just because you don't want to haul back what you didn't use. That's the critical part in the boundary waters, since we still get to use them. But again, in Quetico, there are no worms, there are no leeches, even if they are native. There are no minnows. It is barbless, artificial only.
And someone had a question about inflatable kayaks and canoes. I mean, your thoughts on that? Have you used one?
I never have. I don't know how heavy they are, and I don't know if it's, I assume it's a foot pump to inflate them if you're going to really portage them in. I don't see why they wouldn't work. I like the stability of the canoe that I use. I actually use a Quetico 17, which is a little wider than other canoes, and it's not as fast, but it's definitely wider. And I find the stability especially good when you're setting a hook on a fish. I haven't used one. I don't see why they wouldn't work if you're willing to haul it in. I don't think it would be an issue at all.
Well, Rob, I want to thank you so much for sharing your tips and tricks about fishing here in the boundary waters. I'm so grateful for your sharing your time and information here. I know that a lot of people will have more questions, and for those people, we are recording this, and we will make the recording available to you. We'll send out an email with a link to that recording, so you'll be able to stop this presentation and take notes and continue to benefit from from Rob's insight into this. I know, in the future we'll maybe have look at ice fishing or cooking in the boundary waters, some of these other fun topics here. So I want to thank everyone who's been on this online here. We're so very grateful. We're grateful for your love of the outdoors and your passion for the boundary waters. Our next presentation is up there on the screen here. It's on May 20th, Wednesday, May 20th. And it will be on Glencore's and Polymet's scheme to rip off Minnesota taxpayers. So this involves the Polymet proposed sulfide mine and the lack of financial assurance to protect Minnesota taxpayers. It's another incredibly important issue that we've been involved in for the last several years. And we'll have John Gapp, our board treasurer, or board chair, who will be giving that presentation. So I look forward to having you join us for that. Again, thank you so much for your support of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, and thank you for your passion for the Boundary Waters. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.